Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Anita, Samita, Siddhamma, Sarvamangala, Swati. So, very good afternoon. Even weather is as such. I hope you have finished your lunch. Okay, so today is the third session. Today we'll discuss more on literary criticism, Western literary criticism. It is not Indian literary criticism. So today I'll be dealing with three important critical essays. Two of the essays which I'll be dealing at the initial hour of the session is Matthew Arnold, and the last critical essay I'll be talking on Henry James. Okay, so today I'll be talking on Matthew Arnold and Henry James. So these two important, why these two important critics are read? They need to be read. Okay, English literature students, when we see before understanding uh, the literary criticism, the aspects of literary criticism, you should understand the difference between literature and literary criticism. That is more important because MA students or being a student of literature, you should understand the difference between literary text, literary theory, and literary criticism. These are three complete areas. Okay, you already know what is literary text. Whatever the novels, drama, poetry you are reading is said to be literary text. And literary theory, I am pretty sure that you have come across the literary theories. Okay, literary theories such as starting from new criticism till the late reader response theory or feminist theory, lesbian theory, gay theories, psychological theory, structuralism, post structuralism, all this confined together, we address it as literary theories. And literary criticism deals with the comment, okay, critical interpretation of the literary text. Okay, so literary criticism also deals with the stylistics of the literary genres. So you cannot even though I say or I claim that these three are different, move in different directions, but they go hand in hand. Without understanding the literary theory, you cannot understand the literary text. Without interpreting, without understanding the necessity of interpreting the literary text, you can even not understand the literary criticism. Or I can make you easily understand that literary theory is said to be the skeleton of any body, and literary criticism said to be can be defined as the other organs of a body. Okay, literary theory is said to be the skeleton. That is how you need to understand. Okay, you can associate literary theory as the skeleton of a body and literary criticism as the rest of the important organs of any body. So, to understand, to have a better understanding of the text, you need to understand and able to differentiate literary theory as that of literary criticism. Okay, today I'll deal with literary criticism. Western literary criticism. Even we have Indian literary criticism where rasa theory, dhvani theory are being discussed because it is not prescribed for you. Maybe many of the university have not taken intense. They are speaking, but there is no intense research on Indian literary criticism because it is so rich. And people, we Indians, Eastern University, we only talk and study Western literary criticism, and it is a need of an hour now. Okay, it is a need of an hour that we need to do research and do study on Indian literary criticism. Okay, I'm not taking much of the time. I'll start with Matthew Arnold, the function of criticism at present time. Okay, don't get confused. Please listen carefully because there is no time. The in within an hour, I have to talk on three critical essays. So please, without having much questions, if you have questions, please keep it for the end, so I'll be answering your questions at the end of the session. Okay. Okay. Yes. The function of criticism at the present time is the first critical essay which I am dealing to, which is written by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is a Victorian critic. He is a Victorian poet and Victorian critic. He has written n number of poems. Your Dover Beach, you have come across in your syllabus. Okay, Dover Beach is written by Matthew Arnold. To understand Matthew Arnold and his age, we need to understand neoclassical age, romantic age, and his Victorian age. Okay, I'll be talking, it is more relatable to the next critical essay, study of poetry. In during that time, I'll be speaking on how neoclassical age and romantic period is necessary influencing the Victorian period. Okay. Yes, but now, as of now, I'll be discussing on three important questions. One is what is the definition of criticism, and what is the role of criticism in literary text, and what are the functions, duties, and qualification of a literary critic. Okay, when we talk about criticism, it is equally important to understand who is a critic and what is criticism. Okay, according to Matthew Arnold. Generally speaking, a critic is he acts as an interpreter. Okay, he acts as an interpreter to the text. For example, if I ask you to interpret the nursery rhyme, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Okay, just to make you easily understand this nursery rhyme, you easily and because you have listened to this rhyme from the very uh, childhood, so you easily understand that this is a nursery rhyme, and it is taught to a small kid who doesn't have the ability to understand the alphabets, lyrical, everything. We only simply deal with try to understand the rhythmic words which are in the poem. But as a literary or literature student, we try to understand the tone, the context in which the rhyme has been said. We don't usually, when you look at the lines of the nursery rhyme, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are," it speaks of the timing which it is referring to. It is talking about the night, beautiful moon, where the child is a mother who is trying to feed the child, and she is looking at the sky, the twinkling stars and the bright moon, and she is trying to feed. This is how our folk tradition also is developing, and that's how this rhyming can be associated. Just like that, any literary critic, what is the role of a critic in any literary text or literary comments is that he acts as an interpreter. He tries to bring out the meaning, intricate meaning of the text, and he try to evaluate based on the materials which he has. And many of the critics also try to understand the mindset of the poet or a writer or any narrator for that matter through the literary text. So, altogether, a role of a critic is to interpret the text. And the opinions or the comments or the critical observations of the critic is called as criticism. Okay, but criticism has some of the parameters. You simply can't criticize, or you simply can't critically comment on any literary text, okay, without having a full understanding of the role and essence of understanding the text. Okay, there is a need to understand, and there has a parameter. Okay, literary criticism have their own parameters to understand any literary text. Okay, yes. On the light of this, I'll just mention some of the elements which Matthew Arnold has mentioned in the critical essay. The function of criticism at the present time is published in 1865. It was published in National Review in November in the year 1864, but the next year, 1865, he published this article in a separate journal, in a separate essay book entitled The Essays in Criticism First Series in 1865. So, what are the concerns of Matthew Arnold? Matthew Arnold, being a critic, literary critic of Victorian period, he enlightens the readers of this essay to look at the society of British, which is very pretentious, which seems to be brilliant. Okay, it acts as though people are intellect, but in reality, it is not so. So, Matthew Arnold is commenting on the social, religious, economic, and political conditions which prevailed during the Victorian period in this essay. So, what is the mission of Matthew Arnold in writing the essay, or in writing all his literary essays? Because he has a mission. He want to make make understand the British society, to get them civilized in not in dressing sense or etiquettes which the society inhabits. Instead, he wants to find um, to understand. He tries to understand the society, and he found cultural anarchy in the society. Cultural anarchy is the absence of government, and there is a complete freedom towards the individuals. Okay, any individual will enjoy the complete freedom in the society. That is the meaning of anarchy. So Matthew Arnold finds cultural anarchy and everywhere, and the so-called intellects were pretentious, and the attitude of the people were there seems to be very intellect, but in reality it is not so. So, on the backdrop of this idea, Matthew Arnold started writing literary criticism. Henceforth, what is the meaning of literary criticism? Literary criticism endeavors all the branches of knowledge such as theology, philosophy, music, history, art, science, and it sees the object as in itself is really is. Okay, so literary criticism helps the readers to understand any piece of art as it is shown. A black color is seen as a black. You are not supposed to interpret. If you interpret, which I means to say that you are not allowed to have opinions based on what you presume to. Okay, you are not allowed. Even you have freedom or to objection object, but on a certain restrictions, certain parameters. So here, after defining the importance of meaning of literary criticism, Matthew Arnold speaks majorly on the function and significance of criticism. Function, when we look at the literary criticism, is the work of not creative writing. Okay, it is not a creative activity. Instead, it is a condition which are favorable to creation. Okay, it creates norms, it creates ideas. Literary criticism interprets the creative activity. It is not itself a creative activity. So he also says that criticism should be disinherited. It must remain detached from practical aspects and other political considerations. Okay, so in the study of poetry, he gives a list of stanzas, list of informations where how a critic must be detachable from his notions. Neither he can't be inside a cocoon and think a literary text on his own, based on his own assumptions or notions. Okay, so Matthew Arnold says any critic for that matter, he has to detach from the practical aspects. Okay, and the political consideration. He shouldn't have the his own opinions, his own bias while interpreting or while commenting, critically commenting on any text. To substantiate it, he gives many examples which he come across in his lifetime, and he gives a list of names of the British journals like Edinburgh Review, the Quarterly Review, the British Quarterly Review, and the Times, which did not disinheritedly purse ideas. They are guided and controlled by political parties and their interest. This is what he means by political consideration. See, interpretation cannot be based on someone's opinions or someone's influence, that too political party influence, for any society for that matter. Any nowadays it is happening. Okay, nowadays it's happening. Any publication houses, they are having so much of any writer for that matter, they have to struggle hard to publish their books. There is also anarchy. Okay, there is also hypocrisy, hierarchy in publishing a book. Certain caste people's so-called books are being published easily without hustles, okay, without any problems, but certain it is not. So Matthew Arnold is also commenting on that same issue. So, if a critic is facing so much of difficulties, what is the need to do critical activity or literary criticism, or criticizing any literary art? What is the need? So, Matthew Arnold is also have given list of important benefits, or it has, and he has decided, or he has given uh, his opinion on the benefits of criticism. Criticism can cure man of complacency and self-satisfaction. Okay, it can be cured from complacency. What is the meaning of complacency? A feeling of uncritical satisfaction with oneself or one's achievement, and self-satisfaction. Complacency at times is associated with vulgarizing and retarding, but it is not so. To check further progress on the literary criticism, it becomes a rough task to influence the human spirit. At such times, a role of a critic enacts here. The business of the literary genius is a work of synthesis and exposition. He is supposed to combine and be descriptive about certain aspects. A piece of, especially when interpreting a piece of literature. But the business of a philosopher is to discover and originate new ideas. So this is the difference between what is the what are the there is a framework for a critic to enact. Okay, you can't see a work of a philosopher is to discover. Okay, not to invent, it's to discover and originate new ideas, whereas a critic has to bring out the new concepts, new ideologies within the given framework, within the parameters of criticism, within the theories which he is studying. Okay, so he can't be a creator, he cannot be he cannot act as a creator while interpreting any text. So what are the other important factors which the critic has to enroll himself while dealing with the text? The critic creates an atmosphere, an intellectual situation in which creation can take place. Okay, so the action which the critic has to do is the intellectual situation. He has to always give work for his mind to bring out a real essence of the text. And the creation of the masterwork in literature empowers, or it conquers two elements. One is the power of man and the power of moment. Okay, so critic dwindles or moves, swings between man and moment. Okay, a critic must know the best that has been known and taught in the world, and critic has to update himself. He should know what are the current affairs of the literary implications. Okay, he need to know, and he need to have it. He need to work more on the sphere of mind because it is an intellectual activity. He has to have the coordination between his mind and the book, and the work would be slow and obscure. Yes, any literary or creative work cannot happen spontaneously. Okay, the romantic period poets says that poetry or any work of art is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling if they need to be successful. But all the time it doesn't happen. It's not, you switch on a plug and it's not so easily. Okay, you switch on the fan. It's not like that. It is not mechanical. It needs a creative talent. Okay, and but he must resolutely wait for the creative activity to undergo a process. Okay, some people have a born talent, they have a creative orientation. Okay, whereas rest, they have to work hard on their creative mind. Okay, he would often be misunderstood, but still he must continue with his work with absolute sincerity. Yes, any critic will have to face many problems. At many places, their interpretation is misjudged. Okay, but they shouldn't get disheartened. They need to work even harder, but with utmost sincerity. Okay, that is more important. He must overcome all political and practical considerations. Okay, as I told you before, any critic for that matter, he should not come under the influence of personal opinions, biased or political biases. He shouldn't carry either of the opinions, hence he will be in trouble. There is a chance of misappropriation of the the quality of the work. Okay, it is the duty of a critic to be perpetually dissatisfied with works which fall short of high and perfect ideal. So, these are some of the important aspects of criticism and the qualification of a critic. So, this has been discussed in the functions of criticism in the present time by Matthew Arnold. And coming to the second critical essay of Matthew Arnold, that is the study of poetry, is very much important for your examinations because Matthew Arnold gives you a prolonged discussion on how a literary text has to be looked through. Okay, very first critical essay deals with how text is being developed, how text needs to be understand on its own parameter, literary parameters. But to understand a poetry, there has a different parameter. Okay, all literary genres, whether it might be drama, poetry, fiction. Okay, for all the literary genres, it has its own parameters, and it needs to be evaluated based on its own yes yes own stances. Okay, yes. Let me begin with the second essay for the session, the study of poetry. It is very important. Please be attentive. Okay, yes. This again, Matthew. This is written by Matthew Arnold in the year. It was published in the year 1880. Why Matthew Arnold started speaking more on literary criticism? Because, and he is considered to be the first person to talk on criticism. Okay, literary criticism. He stands first. He stands first to speak more on literary criticism. And what was the need? What was the need of the hour to discuss more on poetry? Okay, Aristotle would have taught already poetry was already a full-fledged famous literary form, and many people were already writing. But starting from Chaucer's, starting from Beowulf. But when in the later years, after Romantics, after Neoclassical age, how come Victorian period poets got into much interest, showed much interest to the literary criticism particularly? That is more important, because Victorian period was in dilemma. Okay, it was in utter confusion. What was the utter confusion? The people who were uh, res- Victorian people were in utter confusion, because they don't know whether to believe in religion or to believe in the new theories, new science theories, which was put forth in front of them. People were in confusion, utter confusion. They didn't know. They were finding difficult to know what to do and what not to believe. This is said to be called as Victorian dilemma. Okay, Victorian dilemma. So the people who are in this confusion, they were finding difficult to either understand the literary which was happening in the literature aspect. So, to lessen down the burden, Matthew Arnold gave rules for critics to be followed while writing poetry. That is what he discusses in the study of poetry. Okay, he has given a set rule, he has given a parameter. Matthew Arnold has given a parameter to the critics, the so called critics, the upcoming critics, to evaluate, to understand poetry. Yes, the study of poetry is published in 1880, and first it was published in an anthology written by T.H. Ward titled The English Poets. And as I told you, Matthew Arnold was influenced by the neoclassical time. The days go beyond neoclassical time, and there is lot of changes. No, a lot of changes as the ages go by till the time Victorians, that is Matthew Arnold, understands it. During neoclassical time, poetry was already existing, and it was in the form of blank verse, sonnets, elegy, whatnot. And yes, so they had set rules. When you look at Shakespearean sonnet, he has a perfect meter, he has a perfect pentameter, he has a rhyme scheme, he has line structure and everything. That is one of the example to understand there was a set rule, a lot of rules to be followed while writing. poetry. And one best example is Pope and Dryden. They too had have set rules, certain rules and standards to write poetry. Those were the maybe the first people to start standardizing the poetry form. And then coming to the romanticism, you see William Wordsworth and Coleridge, who are the pioneers of romanticism. They delineated rules and standards of poetry. Which I need to say that they gave preference to poetry, but not the set standards um, which was followed in your classical time. Instead, they said that Wordsworth said that it is a spontaneous overflow of feeling. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of feeling. Henceforth, there is no set rule. And when you look at the poems of William Wordsworth, all his poems are based on the real life experiences, his own experiences he discusses, and he doesn't go by the rule. Even Coleridge, he doesn't go by the rule. They go beyond the rules and gave more importance to their poetic style, and they did not had any standards, which I mean to say, they did not had any rules, strict rules to be followed. And but lately, Victorians, they were in utter confusion. As I told you, they were going through the period of Victorian dilemma, whether they have to follow religion or the science which they were going. As the age itself was undergoing Victorian dilemma, even critics uh, were in distress. They were also in confusion. They don't know what to do. So here, Matthew Arnold started writing, and he said that it is necessary to put forward some rules and regulations for the poets as well as the critics, so that standards of the poetry can be raised. So this was the motto of Matthew Arnold, to start writing the rules for the poetry. So he says that, I quote, mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. See, he has simplified the understanding of poetry. Poetry is there to interpret us, okay, console us, to sustain us. Which means to say that, is Matthew Arnold indirectly saying that poetry must teach morals? No. I'll tell you why. So he also, Arnold, meanwhile, while discussing his poetry standards, he said that he disapproved Greek philosopher Plato. Okay, Plato is, you might have you might have know Aristotle poetics, Aristotle teacher Plato, who wrote the Republic. And he doesn't, he says that. Uh, who had Plato had many accusations against poetry. He doesn't like poetry, whereas his student Aristotle, he he supports poetry. He feels for poetry. But Matthew Arnold has always comforted himself in poetry. He thinks that poetry is mirror of life. Okay, mirror of life, because to him, poetry is the criticism of life. Okay, poetry stands as a mirror to life, and it is also a criticism of life. There is a lot of difference between these two statements. Okay, these two statements, it has a different meaning. You see yourself in the mirror. You feel, after seeing your own image in the mirror, you feel something. We don't know what is the feeling. You just do it, that is your homework. Okay, you just try that. You see your own self in a mirror, but the feeling which emits after seeing your own image in the mirror, that is criticism. So just to simplify, to make you understand the difference. Okay, So, human nature and what we are is being depicted in the poetry. Okay, the role of the poetry is as such. So, even science, religion, and philosophy is incomplete without poetry. So, many critics are of the same opinion. Matthew Arnold has, as I said before, that he is created rules for understanding the poetry, and he has, just to elevate the poetry, his motto is to give importance to the poetry, to bring back the glory of the poetry, to elevate the poetry. He has three estimates. He constructed three parameters in understanding poetry. The first parameter or the first estimate is historical or historic estimate, and the second is personal, and the third is the real estimate. Matthew Arnold disapproves two estimates. One is the historic estimate and the personal estimate. Why? Because in historic estimate, when you read a novel, you look the historical aspects, historical significance of the text. When we teach students any of the literary text, we simply bring the background story of the writer, why, what is the need of it. But when we look at the historical significance of the text, we try to make them understand the literary text. We also, based on its content, we also try, we forget its weaknesses. What does the text lacks? Okay, what are the factors which is some things are forgotten, we don't look through it. So historic estimates of poetry makes us forget about the important sensible aspects which we need to concentrate on henceforth, and it is not approved. Okay, it doesn't have the significance in that case, so he disapproves historic estimate. Secondly, it is personal estimate. When we try to analyze the text, readers have the tendency to look the text from our own perspective, personal experiences, personal perspective, and likes and dislikes will be prejudiced, will be biased based on that. Okay, we look the text as though we are experiencing. That is the tendency of any writer. In that case, we forget everything. We forget the historical significance, we forget the element of fantasy. And some people, we try to give less importance for the fantasy, but who are interested in the fantasy effect, imagination effects, the ornamentation effects, find lacuna in the text. So even the personal estimate is considered to be not worthy to elevate poetry. So any poetry for that matter should not be evaluated based on these two factors, that is historical estimates and personal estimate. Whereas Arnold proposed, okay, he calls these two fallacies, okay, historic estimates and personal estimate, as fallacies. But Matthew Arnold approved the third estimate, that is real estimate, which is supposed to be unbiased, unlike the rest two estimates. And it reads the poetry and it addresses the reader to read any poetry with an open eye. What does it mean? Does it mean that we need to open our eyes and read the book? No, we need to understand the poetry lines, choice of the words by the poet. Okay, poet simply will not choose a word for his poetry. He has inherent meaning in it. He deliberately, consciously, conscientiously, he uses the words. Okay, so you need to, at the very first, that is what practical criticism teaches you. You need to first read the lines as it is, without having the preconceived notions in the mind. Each and every word, pauses, full stop. Okay, what are the assertive sentences, what are the interpretive sentences, interpretations. Okay, what are exclamations. These are, you need to understand the tone of the lines, tone of the poem. Then you need to have the understanding between the lines. That is what practical criticism teaches, as that of what Matthew Arnold is speaking now in the study of poetry. Okay, you need to have an open eye evaluation of the poetry, and don't blindly forego the faults which the poet has done. You have to have the knowledge of finding fault with the emotions, finding fault with the language which the writer uses. That is how a creative critical critic is developed within you. Okay, there should be a kind of objectivity. A poem or a literary text should not be read from the subjective perspective. Who is subject? You are the subject. You should not be emotionally dwindled while reading any poetry, while writing any poetry, or any literary art for that matter. You need to be objectified. Objectification of the literary text is very much important, leaving behind your own personal emotions while analyzing real poetry, not getting into the historical significance or giving more importance to one's personal taste and dislike, leaving behind historic estimates and personal estimates, uh, to give more importance to the real estimates of poetry. So Arnold proposed a method, a literary method, to be employed by a critic to elevate the importance of poetry, that is touchstone method. The touchstone method, it is a definite question for your examination. Please read more on the touchstone method. Okay? Yes, it is a method to analyze the standard of a poem. Okay, he has what is the what how to evaluate the standard of a poem. Okay, Matthew Arnold has given uh, stances. He has given a formula to understand the standard of a poem. In classical poems are the poems read at all times, irrespective of time, age, or taste. Hence, we call them sublime. Okay, it has the tranquility mode. Henceforth, it is read all the time. To be a great poet, one should imitate the classical writers. The poems should exactly resemble the classics. Okay, when a modern poet is writing the poetry, he needs to write the poetic style. He need to follow the poetic style of the present age, but keeping in mind the influence and there should be influence of the classics confine the high truth, high seriousness, and high supreme diction. This is the formula for a standard poem. It should consist of truth, it should consist of seriousness, it should consist high supreme diction. Okay, without which, this is the format which neoclassical age poets had, and even Matthew Arnold um, gives importance to it. Okay, in Touchstone Method, it is compare the poems with classical sublime poems and decide if the poem is of high standard or not, based on seriousness, truth, and supreme diction. And Arnold he has this formula to evaluate the seriousness of the poem. Arnaud doesn't appreciate French poetry. French poetry is said to be one of the influence for on English poetry. The southern French poems influenced the Italian poetry, whereas the northern France influenced the English poetry. Okay, or you can call England poetry. English poetry was influenced by French poetry, but they lacked the kind of seriousness and diction or truth that Arnold is expecting from poetry. So, Arnold has a definition to understand the what is the right way of writing poetry or right way of judging poetry, evaluating poetry. The seriousness is very much important. To substantiate it, Arnold has evaluated some of the poets of English literature, starting from Geoffrey Chaucer to the late Victorian poets. Okay, he has evaluated who are the poets who are classic and who are the poets who are not classic, which means to say they are serious, but their diction might not be supreme, or they lack the truth of the age. So that's how he has evaluated based on the uh, his equations. Starting from Geoffrey Chaucer, supposed to be the 14th century writer and considered to be the father of English literature, he says that Geoffrey Chaucer is influenced by French and Italian poetry, and according to Arnold, his importance comes from real estimate, not historical. He gives more importance to the text context as such, but his subject and style is supreme, but he lacks seriousness. Chaucer lacks seriousness, is the opinion of Arnold. So Geoffrey Chaucer is not a classical writer. So please, I'll remind you that what is the stances or what are the parameters which Arnold has built to elevate the poetry or give importance to the poetry, is that he should have high truth, high seriousness, and supreme diction. Please remember these words, okay, or concepts to understand. So, for according to Matthew Arnold, Geoffrey Chaucer is not classic because he lacks seriousness. He has also interpreted John Milton and William Shakespeare. He doesn't say, he doesn't, what I mean to say is, he is not evaluating. He simply says that they are classics because they are beyond time, age. Okay, so they have seriousness, they have truth, they have supreme diction. So he considers John Milton and William Shakespeare as classics. Thirdly, he has evaluated John Dryden and um, Alexander Pope, who are Restoration period poets. He says that they are important because they are historical because of their historical estimate. Both are great poets, but they uh, gave much importance. They were famous for their prose rather than poetry. So they are classics not for poetry but for prose. Okay, so John Dryden and Alexander Pope is considered to be classics but for prose, not for poetry. Later, Matthew Arnold evaluates Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray is not considered to be a poet. Why? Because he has written less number of poems, but his poems is considered to be of great value. It has poetic value. Hence, uh, Arnold accepts him as a classic poet. And he also spoken about Robert Burns. He's a Scottish English poet, but he has written more poem in Scottish language than that of English. Henceforth, his style and content is being appreciated, but his poetry lacks seriousness. Hence, he doesn't consider Robert Burns as classic poet. And he has also analyzed Romantics, that is Lord Byron, Shelley, P.B. Shelley, and William Wordsworth. Arnold doesn't try to evaluate them because these people are closer to his age. They are romantics and he is early Victorians. So Matthew Arnold thinks that he might have personal biases against uh, interpreting Lord Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth. Henceforth, he does not evaluate them because they write more on the personal nature of personal human nature. So he ends his essay by self preservation of classics. What is self preservation of classics? Human nature will end the same or it will remain the same throughout the years. People will continue to enjoy work on it. That is human nature. Thus, the classics that wrote on human nature will preserve themselves and stand the test of time. Okay, any literary work which uh, decides or which term to be classic, it needs to leave the test of time, which means to they say that at every age, the text needs to be evaluated by the critics, literary critics of the same period. Otherwise, they'll not stand in the time, the testing of time, and they fail at certain times. Arnold is trying to raise the standards of poetry, which has come down after a romantic period. He also asks critics to compare the work with the classics. Okay, that is the what to say. It's a suggestion given by Arnold to his contemporaries or his upcoming literary critics. He is supposed to be want to take the position of critics to uh, just to compare their work with the classics. Classical elements is they have to have high truth, uh, supreme diction, and they have to have the seriousness of the age. Their work needs to show the seriousness of the age. Yes. So the next and the last literary text is The Art of Fiction, written by Henry James. It's a lengthy essay. I need maybe tomorrow also at my I'll be taking class, so I'll continue there. But I'll leave the class by giving some of the important points on the art of fiction written by Henry James. It is published in the year 1884. Okay, in Longman's Magazine, it's a journal, and Art of Fiction was written in the year 1884. Henry James writes Art of Fiction as a response to the fiction on, sorry, response to a lecture given by Sir Walter Besant in 1884. And his lecture session has been published under the name of Fiction as One of the Fine Arts. Okay, Sir Walter Besant wrote a lecture series article entitled Fiction as One of the Fine Arts. In response to that, Henry James writes The Art of Fiction in and published in 1884. And they have a whatever Walter Besant gives his interpretation on the fiction, Henry James have also contradictorily given answers to it based on giving a literary justification. Okay, he has given answers to it. James begins by referring to the mystery of storytelling. Okay, plot, characterization, and storytelling, the way it needs to be narrated, are some of the important aspects discussed in this literary essay written by Henry James. In the art of fiction, James disagrees with Sir Walter Besant assertion that plot is more important than characterization. So, for the first contention of Henry James is against Sir Walter Besant is that Besant says that plot is important than the characterization, which is disagreed by Henry James. That fiction must have a conscious moral purpose. So, not all literary essays or literary text must have a moral sensibility. Some texts are written for creative writing. Okay, so he doesn't agree with Besant's argument saying that fiction must have a conscious moral purpose. It cannot be followed at all times, and that experience and observation outweigh imagination as creative too. James argues against this restrictive rules which is hindered on the writing fiction, responding that no good novel will ever proceed from a superficial mind. So, in the essay, The Art of Fiction, even Henry James have list out the arguments of Walter Besant and some of the important aspects which he mentions in the essay are as such. There are three main arguments which Henry James discusses in the essay. First one is regarding the narrative fiction. Okay, he accepts that narrative fiction is a fine art. No, there is no problem with it. Whereas it should be valued with the art of painting, sculpture, music, and poetry. Fiction is equivalent to poetry, is equivalently important as that of other literary arts. Secondly, the novel is governed and directed by general laws, which may be laid down and taught with such much precision and exactness as the laws of harmony, perspective, and proportion that guide the other fine arts. Third, mastering these rules is necessary, not not having sufficient for success. Any narrative fiction for its success, only the narrative mastering of the rules to write the fiction is not enough, but whereas it needs to have the powerful artistic talent. Okay, the narrator should have imbibed himself the narrative, the power of narrator artistic talent, without which any writer cannot stand as unique in the world of fiction. Okay, so James agrees to some of the major arguments done by Besant, but he has his own contentions towards James. I'm sorry, Walter Besant. Okay, he accepts the importance and aesthetic interest of the novel, which is spoken by Besant, but he has his own terms of composing or evaluation. In James' views, the only purpose of novel is to represent life. Okay, he is trying to simplify instead of adding on weightage to the creative writing to the literary text. He is trying to lessen down the expectations from the literary text, which I mean to say that it shouldn't be bulged. Any text should not have that bulging context. Okay, it should have a simplification. It needs to be simplified so that it is easy to understand and interpret. The only reason we may held a novel is that it is interesting. He says that there is no need to have the moral implications in any novel. It needs to be interesting. It should convey a message. It needs to be interesting. It should represent life. Okay, it should represent life. Even James has given three essential points in art of fiction. The first one is that James feels that fiction, like all other art of painting, sculpture, music, and poetry, is limitless. Okay, fiction doesn't have limit, but whereas the other field of literary art consists of some limitations, but fiction shouldn't have any limits. Secondly, he says that James rebukes Besant's claim the rules are necessary to guide any form of art. Okay, is it necessary? We don't. And third important point is that James' final point